Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. For this first episode, to be recorded after the results of the presidential election, I brought on my friend and former colleague, Walter Olson. Walter is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, a staunch defender of democracy and liberal institutions, and an expert in the processes and law of American elections. We talk about why the election went the way it went, avenues for electoral reform, and what lessons liberals should take from the results, given that we now need to commit ourselves over the next 4 years to a rigorous defense of liberalism. If you enjoy Reimagining Liberty, I encourage you to check out my companion newsletter, where I write about the kinds of ideas we discuss on this show. You can find it on my website at www.aaronrosspowell.com. Now, let's turn to my conversation with Walter. There was a question going around Blue Sky that I thought might be a good jumping off point for our conversation today. You, like me, like many of us, had thoughts and expectations leading up to election night, and then election night happened. And so the question is, what did you get wrong? What surprised you? What did you think was going to happen that turned out not to be the case?
Well, quite a bit. I guess it's good to start in confessional mode. I thought Harris was going to win and thought that we were going to come in around where the polls were. So I was expecting Congress to split. And if you had revealed one card from the deal to me and that Trump was going to win, I would not have predicted that he also would carry both houses of Congress, because he has not tended always to have coattails in the past. And this time it looked, somewhat as if he did. Nor would I have predicted that the national shift in Trump support would have been so uniform across regions. I stay in touch with New York enough to realize that there have been rightward trends in New York, but this was really remarkably, even Massachusetts. I mean, you can't, unlike New York State, you can't chalk it up to local matters of governance being particularly bad in one place. This was a broad nationwide shift, and I wasn't predicting that at all. So I was left, as so often happens, humbled by the fact that the voters' thinking is so different from what I would try to get into their shoes and think they were thinking.
And we should note there was a story in the days immediately following the election that this was all about depressed turnout, that Biden had that effectively a significant portion of the Biden coalition had just stayed home, whereas Trump hadn't really gained support over prior years. But our friend Andy Craig has been doing a pretty good job of posting the numbers as they continue to come in. It turns out it takes California far longer than makes any reasonable sense to count all of its ballots. And that's not the story, that this was legitimately a shift to the right.
And I saw people not taking that late West Coast counting into account. I saw people making lots of honest mistakes from all over the political spectrum. And then, of course, there also hatched these little conspiracy theories on both left and right from the same data. On the right, you had Tucker Carlson and others saying that the then lagging Democratic vote, which if you looked at it like the Thursday or so after the election, was like 10 million behind. Now, they've made up 7 or 8 of that. So, in fact, it's much closer to an even popular vote, and it's a much more typical turnout experience. I think slightly lower turnout, but not a huge drop from the bang-up turnout preceding, and again explained by the same thing you see on a state-by-state basis, which is about 4% of the vote shifting. Some of that is turnout changes of some people staying home and others coming out, but a lot of it is just constituencies changing who they voted for. And so a traditional kind of election behavior, rather than the dramatic ones of someone boycotting the election or something that had been posited.
Do you have a sense of how much of that turn, so people who legitimately shifted from voting Biden last time around to voting Trump this time around, were voting for the Trump who campaigned this time around? So the person who had the Madison Square Garden rally, the person who has been pledging mass deportations and so on, and whose rhetoric was even more extreme than it was his prior campaigns, versus they were voting for effectively memories of the first Trump administration, that this was a time when food cost less and I was getting big checks in the mail, and so I felt more financially stable, and it wasn't quite about the rhetoric and the particular promises of this campaign.
Well, let me, of course, preface it by saying that with my spotty prediction record, you should probably ignore what I say. And also, of course, the Trump voters that I'm exposed to in my very purple little area that is not nationally typical because it is about evenly divided, which means that the people who explain to me that they're voting Trump will not necessarily have the same issues or use the same language as people in a very, very red state might use. But for them, one syndrome that I saw a whole lot, and here I describe people who are either swing voters or at least feel the need to explain themselves across voting lines, but they, a lot of them say, "Oh, well, we just screen out what he says on a day-to-day basis. He has his audience, and he's a showman, and we don't pay attention to that." The line that I would hear again and again is, "Oh, don't listen to what he says. Pay attention to the actual results and the actual results in the first administration." And we can talk about whether this is filtered through the rosy haze of memory. That rosy haze of memory comes out with a recollection of the economy doing great, the COVID, to the extent that it is remembered at all, is remembered as something that, well, he was trying his best, and he probably did as well as anyone could have done, even though there were problems. And but they remember the idea that he cut taxes, that he was always talking about abundance and economic growth and different things, which generally they like. And the and they remember also a vague feeling that, oh, well, wasn't he for, having more free speech or something? Now, you and I can go at great length about why that's not an accurate, reading as history will read Trump, but it is a surprisingly widespread one. And the with respect to the Democrats, and Harris never did shake the idea that she was going to deliver a second Biden administration. You'd think in some ways that she's sufficiently different in persona and so forth, they would have, oh, she's going to be worse than Biden. Well, mostly the argument was, oh, well, it's going to be more of the same of Biden. And we remember that inflation. And sometimes there'll be a couple of other things, like the disarray of the Afghanistan withdrawal was an important one. And so I would get, and I continue to get as we go through the transition, this business about ignore everything he says, and I guess also we have to add ignore everyone he insists on appointing as cabinet members, that somehow or other it flows over all of the boulders in the river and comes out as a smooth stream of, oh, well, we're going to have peace and prosperity. And peace comes up fairly often. This is something that classical liberals, don't always confirm forefront in the Trump appeal, but his people, his voters, will often credit him with 4 years of peace in a way that they don't credit Biden. And it's interesting to me to see a Republican-leaning electorate that is voting Republican for reasons of peace. That's not the old Republican electorate that I grew up knowing.
You mention, they remember it as a good economic time when, of course, the economy was good for part of his first administration, but it also crashed for a decent chunk of it when COVID hit. And at the same time, like the Biden administration has seen a pretty good economy in terms of the numbers, inflation going down, growth going up, unemployment going down, wages for particularly middle and lower income earners have been going up. Like every indicator seems to be that this is a successful economy and arguably more successful than, the good times of Trump's. Uh, is this an election that, we talk about low information voters? And the point that I always try to drive home to people is if you are like the kind of person who's listening to this podcast, or you're the kind of person who is on social media talking about politics, you are particularly weird in like your degree of knowledge and engagement, and that the people who fall into those camps, I think, wildly overestimate how little the typical voter knows and how little they pay attention. You saw those spikes in Google usage on the day of the election about asking whether Biden had dropped out. You see now a spike in Google searches for who pays for tariffs, which I suspect part of that is angry Democrats Googling good sources to send to their Trumpist family members. But how much of a role did the degree of low information voterness surprise in this one?
Well, okay, let me back up and start with one thing that might seem to explain some of this, although it doesn't explain all of it, which is that post-COVID, the governing parties in virtually all of the democracies found a surge of voter anger, and the ones that were left-wing got thrown out in favor of righties, and the ones that were right-wing got thrown out in favor of lefties. The U.S. happened to change administrations in the middle enough so that it's not clear that COVID and its response was all that clearly associated with Trump more than Biden or Biden more than Trump. So you start there. But one thing that is different is that the U.S. economic research after COVID has been stronger than those other democracies. We just have objectively done better than those European countries, even though COVID behaved in much the same way everywhere. And so that second, more refined question is, okay, the U.S. is doing better than the comparable democracies. Why didn't Biden and the Democrats at least get credit for that? And I have to say, I think that there's a large amount of people not um, grasping the economics in detail, whether that's new or not. I well remember how popular price controls were back in the days of Richard Nixon, and the fact that no amount of economic education seemed to be able to break through to the public about what the sources of high prices were. And the Democrats, in fact, had this whole internal debate themselves between the economists and their friends who said, please don't bring up fallacies about why prices rose. Let's be realistic and explain that some degree of inflation was necessary in order to flood the money with flood the economy with substitute wages and different things. It was a risk worth taking, and we got better results out of it than if Trump had been managing things. In fact, no Democrat actually who was up for election wanted to run on the basis of there are inevitable trade-offs, and policy would have been fairly similar whether you'd had Trump in or us, even though that's an accurate way of saying it. They didn't want to run on that. They wanted to run on the idea that the opponents are the essence of evil, on economic policy, and we can give you all good things simultaneously, which is certainly Trump's way of running on economics and every other issue. And so when you are running on a basis of we have delivered perfection and the other side would not have shared any of this policy, then of course you maximize people's chance to blame you for the bulge of inflation. And I still wonder why can't you train people better to understand, changing rates versus the rates themselves, that why the drop from 8 to 2% is not just like, oh no, it's gone from 8 to 10% because there's been another 2% on top of the 8. Those are two different questions. We've, from an economics background, learned all this stuff and have never lost it. But for a lot of voters, the fact that prices continue to go up, even if at a 2 or 4% rate instead of an 8% rate, added to the grievance.
Well, and it's not just that they continue to go up even at a slower rate. It's that they didn't, I think for a lot of people, that they didn't go back down. That they can remember food prices being lower. I'm in Denver where I live, I think restaurants saw something like 25% inflation throughout the period, and which the period's not very long. And so I can remember when restaurant prices were a lot lower and taking a family of 5 out was a lot easier. And I think that a lot of people simply thought what it means for inflation to go away is for prices to return to what I remember.
Yeah, it's part of it, I think, is that most of the electorate, aside from the oldest couple of quintiles, doesn't really have much memory of the inflation that peaked under Jimmy Carter and then was ironed out under Ronald Reagan. And if you don't remember that, then those differences between a rate of 10 or more and a rate of 2 or 3 they're not fresh in memory. They're not fresh in memory for anyone, really. And but yeah, I took a picture at the supermarket the other day of the price of eggs because I somehow wanted history to know, because if history reads the actual news coverage of the past few years, they're going to assume that the egg crisis was never solved. We would keep on, as it were, flapping our wings saying, avian flu, the chickens all had a flu, just like humans had a pandemic, and they had to destroy many, many millions of them, and egg supplies were interrupted. Wait for them to rebuild the flocks, which doesn't take all that long because of the life cycle of chickens. Well, so there they were at $3 a dozen, which is not too different from, it's much better than the $4.50 or $5. But what was the big egg price contretemps on social media? It was that someone had gone to Whole Foods, and Whole Foods' supply of their special pampered eggs with humane conditions had been interrupted, seriously interrupted. Some of their suppliers had not been able to get them things. So when I went to Whole Foods, which I do just for Christmas shopping to buy special ingredients, I'm not made of money, they had eggs there for like $9.50, and there was a limit of buying 1 dozen. And I thought, okay, that's where that guy got that picture of eggs around $10 that social media was buzzing about as if it were the most important news of the day. And again, the life of someone trained in economics to some extent is one of constant despair about public education. It's why people have funded multi-million-dollar education in economics programs, both for schools and, just as important, for grown-ups.
I want to ask about looking ahead and the lessons we should draw for how we respond. But before we get there, as far as this election goes, there was a lot of worry. I remember a lot of people talking about that there was going to be election malfeasance. And of course, a lot of that was coming from the Trumpists as a way to, in case he lost, have a narrative in place to dispute it. But a lot of it, too, was coming from Democrats who, the governments in red states had had 4 years to manipulate the system, to set up voter suppression systems, to do whatever it was they were going to do in order to ensure victory. Did we see any of that? Like, how did this election go from the concern of like free and fairness?
Well, you have gotten me onto my big issue of recent years, and
That's why I
I
asked you about it.
I will say that um, first, the 2024 election was remarkably honest with very few integrity problems, just like the 2020 election, which was also remarkably honest with very few integrity problems. The difference was that in 2020, you had Donald Trump personally leading a massive campaign of falsification in order to get people to distrust what had been a trustworthy process. And this time you didn't. Now, especially after years of being trained in conspiracy suspicion that something must be going on, it was colorful and interesting to see on both sides the emergence of some of these theories. You found on the left side people coming up with theories about Elon Musk's Starlink, which was used by a few jurisdictions to transmit the data for their polling books. Now, if you know elections, polling books have nothing to do with tabulation of the vote. They simply are a continually updated directory, like a phone book, of who the voters are that you can let in. So even if you somehow hacked them through Starlink, you could not change the outcome of anyone's votes. You might be able to cause problems of looking someone up when they weren't in the directory, but people would quickly figure out that there was a problem in the database then. Anyway, so no, there was no such hacking. And then during that period, when the West Coast slowness to report, and I could go on about how they should mend their ways and report votes faster, but that would be a different podcast. During that period, when they were 8 million votes short of counting them all, you had, various, mostly online commentators from the left saying, "Oh, 8 million Democratic votes have been suppressed. Look right there. Trump is running around as well as he did last time." And the Democratic vote is nearly 10 million votes short. And they so they squeezed from that the idea that voter suppression, although by and large it is charged to go on in the same states that were Republican then and continue to be Republican now. As I like to say, the two elections, 2020 and 24, went on largely with the same personnel, under the same laws, using the same procedures, and they produced two different outcomes. The most economical way of explaining that is that some voters changed their mind, not that a serious amount of massive illegality appeared or disappeared between the 2 years.
Did anything come of on election day? I remember there were the bomb threats being called in to polling places in some cities, and then there was some talk that might have been related to Russian operations, but then I haven't seen anything from it.
Yeah. There were bomb threats. It's hard to pin down exactly from where, because things can come from Russian domains on the internet, but not in fact originate with even Russian individuals, let alone with state action. So it was left somewhat hanging, and perhaps at some point investigation will learn more. These were aimed at Democratic polling places in swing states, and perhaps at creating a grievance if the states were close, that perhaps votes had been suppressed by the bomb threat. The votes were not close enough, and it is a tribute. And there are so many ways in which these elections have been a tribute to the largely volunteer workforce that makes American elections happen. They were put through so much stuff, including vicious harassment. So many of them were harassed at places of work and so forth by MAGA, Stop the Steal type people, and yet they had a public job to do. They, by and large, are very idealistic. It is, by and large, a very bipartisan atmosphere in which people from opposite parties have known each other in administering the things, and they were heroes. I hope that even libertarians can occasionally nominate public actors as heroes. But we have to have elections, and they did a great job on that. Now, And there wasn't as much as far as violence. There were a few fire bombings of drop boxes of votes in the Pacific Northwest, probably done by one person who had some specialized equipment that ordinary arsonists would not have, and was able to do more damage than many of the plans had expected, but still not that much damage. Yeah, I think he incinerated 100 votes, but they were able to get word out in time saying, you people who dropped in this particular box, come in and we'll make sure you get to cast a vote. And they did, and that was fun. I wanted to, before we moved on from the specious fraud theories, of course, the ones with really big platforms that had the specious fraud theories were the Tucker Carlsons of the world, who said when they saw the $8 million fewer Democratic votes temporarily before California had weighed in, aha, the 8 million additional Democratic votes 4 years ago were ballot box stuffing. What does he think his listeners, how stupid does he think they are? Anyone who wanted to make a big investigation of this would start by asking, okay, what states were they missing in? Whoops. End of inquiry. You wouldn't need to, once you had moved past the fact that the vote in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Michigan and Wisconsin was not, in fact, because all those states had reported, you would have your answer right there. And Tucker Carlson, of course, has access to as many sophisticated election analysts as he wants. He wanted to mistake the data. He did not want a good faith answer.
Another aspect of this election that was interesting and ties into your work, so I want to pick your brain about it, is alternative voting methods performed pretty poorly. Ranked choice voting, I think it survived in Alaska, if I remember correctly, but
by a whisker.
It did not do well. What's up with that? Because it does seem like the story of there are better ways for us to be voting that will reduce partisanship or produce results that are more representative of the will of the people is a fairly compelling one. So why did the voters turn on these kinds of ideas?
Well, I got my humility in double servings because, of course, this had been a big issue for me. I had closely covered the 10 or so state ballot measures, which represented a very ambitious attempt to take the Alaska model, and in a moment I'll explain what that is for readers who may not have followed it, and spread it to like 5 more states, all of them in the West. And it was clobbered. Only Alaska voted to retain its system by a whisker. A few states like Nevada, Montana, Colorado came pretty close, like 54-46. So there was a substantial popular support for them, but it did not, in fact, pass. And Arizona and Idaho were even less close. And the Alaska model, which people describe as ranked choice voting, but that's really kind of the cherry on the sundae. The main thing that Alaska does is to abolish party primaries in favor of a one big primary for everyone. Everyone can run in it, and everyone can vote in the same primary. And the idea there is that a lot of the bad candidate choice and polarization that you see in much of the rest of the country is an artifact of America's pretty unusual party primary system, not one that is found in a lot of other Western democracies, in which you have what can be a very low turnout primary. Sometimes only 10% of the electorate will come out. Sometimes it's somewhat higher, but the point is that in order to get on the general election ballot, the candidates have to go through this bottleneck and subject themselves to a gauntlet of the base of one party or the other. They either have to get past the Republican base or they have to get past the Democratic base. And lots of candidates get weeded out at that point for not having flattered and wheedled the base enough. Alaska adopted it in part because Senator Lisa Murkowski, who is nominally Republican, but in practice represents just about exactly the 50th percentile ideologically, a very, very, very moderate Republican who votes with Democrats on quite a lot of things. She had no particular path other than creating her own party or being a write-in candidate to ever get reelected, because she could never get through a Republican primary. That's what Republican primaries are like in almost every state. And it's not as if this doesn't affect the Democrats, because the Democrats had seen a lot of veteran, often fairly respected figures picked off by more ideologically militant primary challengers themselves. So here Alaska comes in and says, okay, no more power to the party base. The independents, who I think are as high as like 70% of the Alaska electorate, may not be quite that high, but it's a very large number, who are shut out of partisan primaries, can come in and vote. Those who, as is quite common in Alaska, like to ticket split and pick a Democrat for one level and Republican for another level, and maybe an independent for yet another one, can vote all of that in the same primary, as opposed to so-called open primary systems in some other states in the lower 48, where you have to go into the ballot box and either pick the Republican one, even if you dislike most of the people on it, or pick the Democratic ballot, even if you dislike most of them. You can pick the best people, whichever party you're with, at the primary stage. So lots of appeal. And Alaska has had, in my view, really good results, in that, at least if you like the idea of breaking up the ideological control, Alaska would, in most other circumstances, be controlled by MAGA types, because it is Republican primarily, and the MAGA voters can get a majority in Republican primaries. That's just the way it is. So they would be running the show, were this another state with similar voting patterns. Instead, since Alaska introduced its reforms, not only did Lisa Murkowski get reelected, not only did the House seat have a very interesting thing where Sarah Palin ran and lost because she was personally unpopular with Republicans, rather than because, and as well as Democrats. So they made discerning selections there. This time they went back and picked a standard Republican, because Sarah Palin was not running. But and then, most interesting, in both houses of the Alaska legislature, what formed were bipartisan coalitions in which the MAGA Republicans were excluded, and a bunch of Democrats and a bunch of Republicans instead vowed to cooperate, splitting committee chairmanships between them, so that the state would have practical-minded leadership rather than screaming all the time. And so that's what happened in the one state that adopted it. I would think that would be, pretty attractive for other states, but voters disagreed. And so I separate that from ranked choice voting. Alaska uses ranked choice voting after it gets its final four. Then it uses that on election day to pick to which of those final four advance to office. But most places where ranked choice voting is on the ballot, it's not bound up with primary reform. It is instead just a way of running an election. And there, a story that's been going on for quite a while, continue to go on, which is that cities really like it. Washington, D.C. became the latest, and there were a couple of others like Oak Park, Illinois. And ranked choice voting, if this keeps up, within not all that long a time, is going to be a standard way of voting in large and even medium-sized cities. It's just making that kind of progress. But states are different. States and one of the ways you can think of this is that cities typically have one-party politics, in which that primary makes all the difference in the world, and ranked choice voting allows them to adjust for some of its faults, adjust for the problems that in non-ranked choice voting cities, in which someone can become mayor with 29% of the vote over a split field, and they're actually not a very popular or a very good mayor, but everyone else was so split. And ranked choice voting is beautifully tailored to that. Now, that's not the way that states work in their elections for governor and other things. They are not typically one party. They don't fall into that. And so states have been much more reluctant. Yes, the state of Maine passed it. Alaska passed it as part of this. But if you look back only a few years ago, Massachusetts turned it down. Massachusetts, just about the most progressive state. And there you get to the politics of both of these reform plans. But let me just stay on ranked choice voting for a moment. When ranked choice voting comes in, the party establishment of both parties typically reacts as if it had sat on a tack on its chair, and jumps into the air and predicts absolute doom. The Republicans and the Democrats absolutely equally loud. Uh, you can find a few exceptions. The Alaskan Democrats have turned in favor because they saw that it was, better than the shot they were getting otherwise. A few Coloradans, like Governor Jared Polis, have been good on it, but by and large, the entire party establishment is negative. And then you have, so who else participates in the public debate about these things? Well, you have the interest groups and the pressure groups and the ideological groups. Now, just over the past few years, the conservative movement, which had been largely on the sidelines, and to the extent that they had come up by reading economists, they might have been very favorably predisposed because economists have been historically just about the number one constituency for ranked choice voting, which is why Cato likes it by and large. But anyway, the conservatives had been mostly on the sidelines, and Heritage Foundation and some large donors and others came in and have ginned up, spending millions of dollars, have done a whole national campaign, which has succeeded in making the conservative opinion pipeline just sort of a fire hose of anti-ranked choice voting commentary. So that has changed. Meanwhile, on the left, very interesting that the American Prospect, representing the more or less soft socialist part of democratic politics, ran a very hostile piece in September by Harold Meyerson, I believe it was, saying, look, this is being pushed as progressive. Don't do any of this stuff. Our power currently consists of being able to roast moderate Democrats in the primary and force them to commit to all of our positions. If we lose that leverage, they're just going to govern as they think best for the general public. I'm of course paraphrasing. He did not put it that way. And he said, and that's why in San Francisco and these and various other places where this has been coming in, it's considered just terrible by the most radical unions and the various nonprofits that had been in charge of San Francisco government. And in fact, indeed, I like to say, as a sequel to all that San Francisco threw out a lot of the very, very left-wing people who have been running it in favor of more moderate Democrats, and ranked choice voting played a role in that. The most prominent socialist supervisor lost in ranked choice voting. He led in the first round because the moderates were split, and then as ranked choice voting redistributed the second choices of the moderates, he lost.
Is there an angle or challenge in reforming voting systems that, I mean, everything you just described, so when you were describing the Alaska setup, I can imagine it just sounding complicated. Like this is, and people have been voting. They know how the voting works. They know that there's two candidates and they pick the one that they want. They know that there's primaries they can participate in if they want to, but most don't. Is there just a challenge of voters have misgivings about the current system, but this sounds like a lot. It sounds complicated. It sounds like I don't know exactly what's going to happen if we do this. Just don't rock the boat.
That is certainly some of it. And it's also something that works more against the schemes to abolish party primaries because they are more complicated. They do more, and they are, let's face it, a more radical leap into the unknown. Ranked choice voting, in some ways, is one of the most familiar and long-standing of these changes. It's been practiced for a long time. We know a great deal about how it works. Abolition of partisan primaries, not so much. And we don't know how the players will adjust necessarily to that. We don't know whether the parties, as this is one big concern, not just to people who run the parties, but there is concern that maybe the parties will be weakened by it, and that will have other knock-on effects in unrelated areas. And I think that's wrong, but again, it's not unrealistic to want a discussion of that and not to want to be rushed into, again, with most states with the ballot initiative process where people collect signatures, the good part is that you can get change that it's impossible to get any other way. The bad part is that if you haven't thought through all of the different details of how the machine works, it's very hard to change afterwards, sometimes almost impossible to change afterward. And so you get this, what's in the package? Is it going to explode if I pull the ribbon and open it? And so a lot of that is understandable. I think that if you look in an area like citizen redistricting commissions, which finally began to get some traction within the last 10 years or so, you see that it has taken about 25 years. Arizona went first, and then it took about 10 years for California to go second, and then it took a whole bunch more years before Colorado and Michigan and some other states. And typically, with respect to the point I made, each generation had refined the models to avoid some of the problems encountered with the first couple of generations, so that the Colorado and Michigan citizen redistricting panels adopted much more recently are much more highly functional and fair, in my view, than the Arizona and California ones.
Let's turn to the promised looking ahead. So you and I share a commitment to defending liberalism and liberal institutions. Liberalism didn't do well in this last election and is likely to do fairly poorly over the coming 4 years. And so we can diagnose the election all we want, but what matters now is like, okay, what do we do now? What do we do next? What happens over the next 2 years, 4 years, and beyond? And if the story of the election is simply there was inflation, the US handled it better than most countries, but there still was inflation. People remember when prices were lower, and the US, just like every other country, saw its incumbent party suffer losses, the party that had been in power during COVID suffer losses, then the answer there then seems to be, well, then we just wait. Next time around, people will have had another 4 years or another 2 years for the congressional elections to get used to the new price levels. Or if Trump institutes mass deportations and high tariffs, they're going to have sudden shocks of much, much higher price levels than we have right now that they'll likely hold against the party in power. And so there's not much of a lesson for liberals to draw from this, except it sucks when inflation happens on your watch. But is there more we should be drawing than that?
Yeah, and you have well set up half of the range of possibility, which is that if you believe that this last election was decided on, quote, normal, unquote, issues like the economy, then to that extent, we may be simply going through the normal cycling that has characterized the American, that at some point, if Trump follows through, farming areas are going to discover that half of their workforce has been deported, even as tariff wars destroy much of their market for the agricultural exports. And they may rethink things, no matter how many subsidies he tries to give them, if they've got that combination. But let me talk about the other half of the landscape, which is the issues that are not typical of American election cycles. And I know, as one who was pursuing quote-unquote democracy issues, I don't really like that term, but some combination of rule of law and constitutional adherence and so forth. I was preaching that up and down every street in 2024, but Kamala Harris's pollsters consistently told her, I believe, that those issues did not engage and rouse the public. Those were not big vote-winning issues for her. The people in the middle who were undecided didn't treat that as the deciding issue, and even her base. And so that's grounds for possible deep concern if you believe that those issues are ones that will still be important to America long after the cycles have been forgotten of whatever damage is done by a cycle of high tariffs that followed probably by a free trade cycle after that. But damage to the institutions through which we are supposed to govern ourselves, damage to the question of whether or not we have strongman government, could last far, far longer than that. So is it that we're wrong? Is it that the public doesn't understand? What gives on this? And naturally, when I talked with people who were planning to vote for Trump, I brought up these issues. And again, I don't speak necessarily to a random cross-section. It could be the people who want strongman government who do turn up in the polls. Polls indicate that something like 20% of the electorate is willing to articulate a desire for strongman government. That's different from 50%, but it's still 20%. But the people that I talk to almost never put it that way. They would say, well, I can see why you would be concerned if you think that there's a threat of strongman rule or his using the government to prosecute people or his going after the journalists and the press. But after all, and then I would begin to hear exactly the same litany. Isn't that what we've been having? Haven't they been using prosecution against him for political reasons? And at that point, you get into a detail of in my view, the good grounding of the two federal cases, and they just don't want to stick around for that. But haven't we been getting censorship through the White House calling social media, telling them whose posts to take down? And I was against the White House doing that. So I have to give them some leeway. I agreed that the New York legal actions against Trump, were clouded by indications that there was some political motivation. It's not as if they had zero case on these things. And on strongman, they would say, oh well, but Biden just has thumbed his nose at the Supreme Court. In practice, Trump always winds up taking the lawyer's advice. And I raised my hand, and they admit, okay, maybe not after January, not around January 6th, but otherwise they say he always wound up taking the lawyer's advice. And so we've argued ourselves to something of a standstill there. They just don't believe he's as much of a threat, and they also take what to some extent has been an actual series of bad acts by the Democrats and Biden, and they blow up the danger. They refuse to acknowledge that on things like the White House calls to social media. You've had the courts and the agencies and others pronounce on that, and sort of everyone agrees that it was a bad example and so forth. So that leaves me with, paradoxically, a ray of hope in that if Trump begins doing the things that I fear, and I think you fear, he is going to start doing pretty fast, we can come to them and cash in their own stated principles and say, look, you were very concerned about the appearance of political prosecution. Don't you think that the prosecution of whatever, Jack Smith or Liz Cheney or whoever he decides to prosecute, doesn't that look like a political prosecution to you? And I think get some people to recoil. Same thing if his actions on the press or on one-man rule are as we fear they will. This bothered you when you saw the Democrats doing it. Doesn't it bother you all the more? And I think that thus might be the seeds of the public's swinging back in the opposite direction, with many possible outcomes, including, midterm return to divided government, more public support for instances like with the U.S. Senate against Matt Gaetz, where Republicans decide to get some spine and say no on something. If they're hearing from the public, no, we want you to do what Trump says, that's one thing. But I'm not sure that's what they're going to be hearing from the public if we do our job correctly of arguing the issues.
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you enjoyed today's episode, please send it to a friend, or take a moment to review the show on Apple Podcasts, and check out my free newsletter at www.aaronrosspowell.com.